Hello everyone! I did it! I read The Winds of War and Remembrance by Herman Wouk. This was a daunting task that I set for myself, something I put off for a while, but it wasn't quite the challenge that I had been bracing for, at least not in the way that I'd expected. First, a little background. I published a review of the 1983 and 1988 miniseries adaptations of these books on April 6th, 2019. In that video, I think, I talked about my indecision regarding reading the books first or watching the miniseries first. I chose to go ahead and watch them first. Some people might cry out that that was the wrong decision, but there wasn't really any point here where I was kicking myself for not reading first. In a way, it was helpful to have already seen the miniseries because I had some mental images to fall back on, with there being so many characters and locations and developments. I might have struggled to keep everything and everyone straight otherwise. This way, I knew who the central characters were, and I knew I had a general idea of where things were going, and I could visualize certain places better. And because I waited 2 years, a little over 2 years, I was able to read without being aware of every little thing that was going to happen. Like I said, I had a general idea, but I managed to forget quite a lot of the smaller details. I do think, however, that my experience with the second half of War and Remembrance would have been different if I had managed to forget the final outcome. Not of the war, but what happens to the main characters, especially the Jastros. That was impossible because, well, the miniseries did a really good job making itself unforgettable. Consequently, when I got to reading the book, there were portions where I felt kind of restless, for a few reasons, but I'll get to that. It needs to be said that Herman Wouk, when after years of effort he published these books in the 70s, intended them to be read as one volume. They were planned as one volume, but he decided a split was necessary when it took so many pages just to get to the bombing of Pearl Harbor. The Winds of War he described as a prequel to War and Remembrance, which is the main story he wanted to tell, focusing primarily, but not exclusively, on the Holocaust and pivotal naval battles of the war in the Pacific. The Winds of War covers events from early 1939 to late 1941. It goes into great detail about the inner workings of Hitler's Germany, with the central protagonist, Victor Pug Henry, a naval attaché sent on an assignment to Berlin, getting a first-hand look at the situation. Meanwhile, Wouk also analyzes the status of several countries, but especially the United States, and the attitudes of its citizens toward joining the fight as tensions build, war erupts, and the threat draws closer to home. War and Remembrance picks up immediately where The Winds of War leaves off, and follows essentially the same cast of characters through to the end of the war, focusing on the victories and tragedies, the gains and losses of this tremendous global conflict. Both books took me 6 weeks each to read, although there were days when I would read just a couple pages, and there were days when I would fly through 50 to 70 pages, so I was not consistent. As soon as I finished the first one, I ordered the second from the library, giving myself just a few days break in between. So I have spent the last 3 months, the whole summer basically, reading this historical epic duology, and nothing else. I will be honest, there were many times in the last month when I was itching to read something else. 3 months is a long time to spend with one cast of characters, especially when you feel pretty iffy about some of those characters. I enjoyed the books, let me be clear about that. But within the 1,930 pages or so, and it would have been more if the font in this book, War and Remembrance, wasn't so small, there were things I didn't enjoy. I knew some of the subject matter was going to be rough because I saw the miniseries. I knew how intense it was going to get with the mass executions of the Jews and the concentration camps and the ghettos. As it turns out, that material was not as difficult to read as I'd expected, and what I found more challenging was maintaining my interest through the other chapters about the personal dramas and especially the romantic entanglements of the Henry family. Granted, when these chapters came along, the reading went much faster. There was more dialogue, and the fictional narrative didn't require as much concentration, so the pace picked up. But the fact that I wasn't so interested in some of these obviously minor plot lines meant I didn't want to spend so much time on them. I felt eager to move past the lighter chapters and get back to the real business, the stuff that was really important. I find little fault with the writing itself. Wouk's prose is clear and engaging, and there are some brilliant expository passages. I appreciate the fair way he handles some of the controversial issues that people still debate about, presenting multiple sides of every issue and seldom inserting himself and his own views into the narrative. There were points where I felt like I knew where he stood on something, but he held back. And that's something that a lot of people, a lot of writers these days don't know how to do. The action is exciting and relatively clear, provided that you have sufficient knowledge and understanding of the war and terminology to follow what's going on in the first place. I have read multiple books about World War II, and I have seen a lot of war movies, so this wasn't too hard for me. It is evident in the text that Wouk knows his stuff. Plus, he did copious research, and it shows. It's worth reading the historical notes in the back of the book to see just how careful he was to stick to the truth while bringing these events to life for the modern reader. The parts that read like a textbook and offer straightforward commentary on the war with no intervening fiction to distract you were the strongest, at least in my opinion. And I love that Wouk included excerpts from fictional books within his novels. It's a nice metafictional touch there. World Empire Lost and World Holocaust are written by Armin von Roon, a fictitious member of Hitler's general staff, a loyal officer of the Wehrmacht, and private critic of the Führer, who provides the German perspective on the war not just in Europe, but in the Pacific as well. While reading The Winds of War, I found myself eagerly turning the pages to see what would happen next. And that's in spite of the fact that I remembered scenes as I encountered them. I didn't have quite the same experience with War and Remembrance. At times, yes. There was one point when Dr. Beck shows up again, and it was so intense I had completely forgotten about it. It took me by surprise, and it was nerve-wracking. But there were also stretches where momentum slowed as my engagement lagged. I do feel that there was an imbalance. There was an imbalance on my end with what things I was interested in and what things I just felt kind of apathetic toward. But there was also an imbalance on Wouk's end. You can tell what Wouk was most interested in, the Germans and the US Navy. There is relatively little said about European combat compared to the many chapters about naval battles in the Pacific. There were 6 chapters about the Battle of the Light Gulf, and there were, I don't know, it was 75 pages, I think. I know that those are not equal terms of measurement about Midway. So it just seems like the scales are so uneven, and there's a lot of time given to analyzing the German philosophy, German and National Socialist philosophy, while there's not so much said about the Japanese and what brought them to this point. Wouk does examine different cultural philosophies and psychologies. He talks about the psyche of the Americans, the Germans, the British, the Russians, the Jews, to a lesser extent the Italians and the French, though I think he talked more about Portugal than France. More than halfway through The Winds of War, I was still waiting for him to talk about Japan in more than a passing reference to them as a potential enemy hovering on the horizon. I get that maybe he was reflecting the attitudes of the time that were discounting them as a real threat, but he also shows an America that's far more concerned about a war with Japan than a war with Germany, and that's why Congress drags its feet on getting involved in Europe. So much of the book is about passing Lend-Lease. I don't know. Wouk doesn't delve into what's been going on with Japan until chapter 45 of The Winds of War, where Warren Henry delivers a clear and concise lecture going back to their successful 1905 sneak attack on the Russians at Port Arthur, which he refers to as the point where modern Japanese history starts. It's very helpful that Wouk laid this out so neatly, and it was easier to understand than some other explanations I've heard, but he waited until so late in the game. The parts of the books I thought were the weakest, and these are very well-written modern classics, so their weak spots would be perfectly adequate in a lesser work, were those that dealt with pure fiction. And this is a subjective thing. Maybe for other people, these are the parts that they enjoyed the most. But I am just not interested in wartime romantic entanglements. I never have been. I don't like war movies that have a whole lot of romance to them, especially when it's love triangles and things like that. Stay focused on the war. That's what I'm here for. Some of Wouk's fictional characters are inspired by real-life individuals, or they're composites of real people. Others are purely fictitious. I'll make a few comments about the featured characters, starting with the lead, Victor Henry. I don't really have any complaints about Pug himself. He is an honorable man trying to do his duty to the service, to his country, to his president, to his family, and to God. But I still find it hard to believe all the things he gets up to. He becomes FDR's private informant about Berlin. He gets to meet with Hitler, Mussolini, Churchill, Stalin, and Stalin remembers him when he sees him again years later. Pug is the one who organizes the first big lending to the British. He's instrumental in solving the landing craft problem for the D-Day invasion. He plays a role in the Light Gulf battle, and he's in on the secret Manhattan Project. It piles up. He is not the lead figure in any of these things. He's on, he's not exactly on the periphery. But just that he's there, and just that he does all these things, I don't know. It's over and over, it's impressed on us how insignificant this man is. He's supposed to be someone whose career went nowhere for 25 years and he's been passed over. Yet he shows himself cool and clever under pressure, a good man of action and firm decision, who has diplomatic finesse. He's smoother in some of these diplomatic situations than some of the diplomatic people are. And over, he distinguishes himself with people. He's not just present for the meetings with the big cheeses, he has whimsical little exchanges with each of them. So there's some unevenness here, and all of it makes me incredulous. It works really well for the story. It allows the narrative to travel to all these different places and gives us a chance to see real people in less formal settings. It's just far-fetched to me. I spent a good portion of the Winds of War miniseries not liking Natalie Jastrow. The character was irritating, and I had a similar first impression here. She comes across as over the top and artificial, but there's a turnover, which happens sooner in the book than in the miniseries, though it did happen in the miniseries. She's increasingly more likable, more relatable, more stable, and mature. She is a fighter, and you have to admire her efforts, even when they're not successful. And you come to appreciate, or at least I came to appreciate, that Natalie, at least, is honest. Something I can't say about the other female characters. Rhoda Henry is awful. She's annoying and vain and hypocritical, and I couldn't stand her. But I acknowledge that she is a pathetic figure, and I would feel sorry for her if she would just be quiet and give me the chance. Pamela Tudsbury I liked less, being able to read her thoughts, which is funny because I didn't have a problem with her in the show, but my mom did not like her at all. I find her pursuit of Pug, a married man whose fidelity to his wife is something she admires, to be aggressive and, at the risk of sounding old-fashioned, unbecoming. And her wild past and one-track mind all just makes her sound like kind of a basket case. I know she isn't, and the way she behaves in some very intense, dangerous situations is rational, but her personal life makes her sound like kind of a mess, and there's something distasteful about her, though she's not as bad as some others. Byron Henry's okay. It's kind of weird how he transforms from a lazy loaf to an overprotective, intensely moral guy, but you can see how drastically the war changes him. He is a different person at the end of the duology than he was at the beginning, which is something that happened. There were people who completely transformed in different ways over the course of the war. So there is a verisimilitude in that. Madeline Henry, well, Pug thinks she's kind of an idiot, and so do I. But I will say this, she does kind of redeem herself toward the end. But she's a featured character for so much of it, and then she becomes like a footnote. I'm not sure who I liked less, Madeline Henry or Janice LaCouture. Madeline is a type, and probably her worst fault is her poor decision-making and her impetuosity. Janice was calculating and dishonest and insincere, and there's a whole bunch of things I hated about her behavior in War and Remembrance, but I'm not going to go into that. Warren Henry, I don't have much to say about him as a character. He's almost put on a pedestal, so that makes him kind of a boring character. Aaron Jastrow is incredibly irritating through 95% of the Winds of War and a little of War and Remembrance, but like his niece Natalie, he has a turning point. He gets so much better and redeems himself several times over. His diary entries show him to be honest and humble and far-seeing. It's impressive how Wouk pulled off this character arc, which completely changes how the reader feels about him. He is not a tower of strength, but he is a well-rounded character, well-developed, more so than his brother Beryl, who is strong, much stronger than Aaron, but he's more of a static character. And Leslie Sloat I liked better in the miniseries, or I should say I came to like better in the miniseries. I didn't start off liking him in either, but he gets a more favorable edit in the miniseries. I had a different impression of his relationship with Natalie there than I did in the books. I'm not sure if it was my mistake or if something about how it was acted. Leslie also has an interesting arc. He's guilty of soft anti-Semitism. He's willing to sleep with Natalie but not marry her because marrying a Jew would not be advantageous for his career. But then he becomes the one person in the Foreign Service who makes a stink about what the Germans are really up to with the Jews, to the point that it damages his reputation. And his frustration with the State Department leads to some really great acerbic observations, and leads him to choose a completely different path for himself, for better or for worse. About partway through War and Remembrance is when I come to like Sloat, when he advocates so hard for getting the truth out there. He is basically slamming his head against a wall, but I admire him for trying. And at least his outrage and horror is genuine, while others just frown when they hear the details of reports coming out of Eastern Europe and they kick the can down the road. It's the Jewish problem. We don't really want to deal with that right now. As far as the relationships go, 2/3 of the way through The Winds of War, I realized that I cared more about the war itself than about the side romances, but I felt you needed that drama to break things up and give your brain a breather. Not halfway through War and Remembrance, though, I decided it wasn't worth it even for that. It just interrupted the flow of the more pressing, more interesting stuff. The least interesting storyline to me was Madeline's adventures at CBS and her getting involved with her boss. But the funniest part in the duology was a confrontation between him and her brother, so maybe that made it all worth it. Maybe. It was Rhoda's love drama that I found the most irritating, even more so than in the miniseries. In her desperation for attention, she turns into a deceitful and destructive person, and it's self-destruction, and she's deceiving herself along with her husband, and that's why I said earlier that she is a pathetic character, and you know that she's not going to be happy, ever. But I don't know, I just felt like, can we go back to what's going on in Europe? I'm so much more invested in that than in this. I wish that the bulk of the personal conflict didn't just deal with extramarital affairs. There are so many other kinds of relationships and human dramas that would appeal to me far more. For example, I found the dynamic between Pug and Byron very interesting, and I wish there had been more things like that. I know it's wartime, and so things change, but I just don't care to read about so much infidelity. So those are the fictional characters. Then there are the many historical figures. As I said, Pug meets Hitler a couple times, but we mostly read about him through Armin von Ruhn's jaded account. Ruhn brings up one of the more amusing elements, Hitler's chronic flatulence, which I'm not sure I knew about or not. I looked it up, and yeah, that was a real thing. The world leader who gets featured the most is Roosevelt, and I would say that Wouk's portrayal of FDR is multifaceted. It's not unfavorable, but it's not glowing either. Rune talks about Roosevelt becoming a legendary figure after his time, but he paints him as a master manipulator who was pulling the strings all along to get the American people to agree to go to war. He sees FDR as someone who was greedy for power and made promises to get elected, knowing full well he would break them. Since it's Rune saying this, and Rune is on the opposing side, maybe we're to assume that Wouk has the opposite feeling. I don't know. Henry himself is wary of the private communications, and his feelings are confused and reactionary. Is Roosevelt a phony and a snob, or is he a powerful, magnanimous man? Henry can't make up his mind. But when Rune refers to the old hypocrite in the White House and his pseudo-royal family, Pug jumps in to denounce Rune's slurs of Roosevelt, our greatest president since Lincoln. So in spite of his misgivings, at the end of the day, he's still very positive about him. Characters repeatedly refer to Winston Churchill as a gifted phrasemaker, but a bungling adventurer who doesn't really have a clue what he's doing. Stalin gets kind of a soft treatment, although there is talk of him having many people killed. I don't know if it was Wouk's intention to make Admiral Halsey look like a jerk, but he does. MacArthur is referred to as overdramatic and self-interested. Eisenhower doesn't have much personality, and Pug notes that Truman is a sharp contrast to FDR, and he misses the schmoozing, but he concedes that maybe that contrast isn't such a bad thing. Though I don't think it's right to assume that every view the characters express is one that Wouk himself shares, Wouk does seem to use his characters, especially Pug and Rune, as a mouthpiece for his views on the war, its causes and effects, the reasons and motivations behind various successes and failures. Some of the points expressed in Rune's book, the ones that aren't so outrageous that Victor Henry has to make a statement of correction at the end of the chapter, are valid, and there's something provocative about that. I had gotten a couple warnings beforehand that I might find the Rune sections a slog to get through, but on the contrary, I enjoyed them a lot. They are creative, and Rune, who is Wouk kind of playing devil's advocate, makes some pointed observations. For example, he refers to World War II as the War of British Succession, a dismantling of the British Empire and contest to see who picks up the mantle. It turned out to be the United States, to Germany's chagrin. This is not a foreign concept to me, but the phrasing of it all was fresh to me. And he claims that Hitler sincerely wanted a negotiated peace with Britain and the rest of Europe, with Germany running things and working jointly with the United States. He never wanted war with the United States, to quell the rise of the Soviet Union. A you and me versus the Bolsheviks kind of deal. Rune then repeatedly claims that the decision to side against Germany and help the Russians through Lend-Lease was a mistake in the long run, leading to repercussions that resulted in ongoing cultural decline. I think Wouk expertly shows the German view without making it cartoonishly indignant and bombastic. And then there is an occasional glint of humor, like when Rune insists on referring to Nimitz as Chester von Nimitz. During the midway section, Wouk pauses in his narrative mid-battle for Rune to make his unique observations on what happened there. The way the two commentaries overlap but then disagree at points, you can forget that Rune is not actually a real person, and that Wouk did, in fact, write all of it. Rune also frequently dismisses armchair strategists and expresses contempt for Anglo-American centrism and historians who obsess over the same events ad infinitum, overlooking other events of equal importance. Given what Wouk himself chooses to expand on in his novels, I suspect that this might have been his own feeling toward World War II historians. As for his handling of the Holocaust, clearly this is what the novels are intended to revolve around. This is the heart and soul of the epic. And as Wouk pulls the curtain back on what was going on, the subject matter becomes more difficult. In the sections at Auschwitz, Wouk switches to present tense, which creates a more immersive feeling. Wouk chose to show a special operation, the gassing of hundreds of Jews, from the perspective of the Germans standing by to observe, not the victims. This is done this way in the miniseries as well, but it's more showing both perspectives there, and being able to see the humiliation and the fear and panic for yourself renders a much different response. In the book, scenes of mass murder have a sense of removal. He avoids sentimentalism and at times actually goes so far in the opposite direction. The casual attitudes toward the terrified Jews is revolting, and some of the language used is so coarse and offensive. You can't get much more offensive. Wouk does not shy away from some of the more disturbing details. Body disposal and things like that are both disgusting and dispassionate. I wonder if maybe he didn't want to manipulate his audience with his words, but it still horrifies the reader, or at least it should, with the total dearth of compassion and humanity. The Wannsee Protocol article by Rune, as well as Victor Henry's preface to it, is a pivotal chapter. Pug explains his reasons for publishing such offensive material in spite of protest and uproar, and I suspect this doubles as Wouk's own explanation for why he goes into such grueling, chilling detail, and why he's taking pains to show the German viewpoint, abhorrent as it is. And what Rune has to say, even with him not being a Nazi Party cheerleader, is sickening. The claims and the doublespeak should make you angry. The insistence that the gassing was euthanasia and the mass murder was a way to bring a merciful end to the Jews who had suffered so much for so long and, don't forget, had been barred out of every other country. Because there is this sense of removal in certain earlier extermination scenes, it makes later scenes with characters that we have become attached to, that we've gotten to know, more effective. The terror as they are degraded and abused, and I'm not going to go into details here, becomes personal, and the reader identifies with them in desperate conviction that if they don't do what is demanded of them, if they don't debase themselves, this will be the end of their lives. There are a couple shocking scenes that are hard to take, and they were in the miniseries as well. All of the Holocaust scenes in the miniseries adaptation of War and Remembrance were stressful and made me feel sick. But some of them play out differently in the book, and I think the ones that affect characters personally are more agonizing. There's probably a lot more that I could say on this topic, but I'll just leave it there. The conclusion of War and Remembrance is kind of hurried. Around the last 300 pages or so, you can start to tell that Wouk is trying to wrap things up. Previously featured characters don't seem important anymore. They're brushed off with a couple lines indicating their trajectory, and time is moving very fast. The days race by. Wouk touches on highlights of the war and goes into detail on few things. Then it becomes interesting to note what he does choose to dwell on when he's flying through so much. Some things are glossed over on the personal drama front, which is strange considering the amount of detail that came before. There are one or two convenient deaths, and a few characters are dispatched in terse paragraphs, with equally terse epitaphs. And the end of the European conflict and the entire war feels anticlimactic. Again, this could be intentional because it is talked about how quickly the American citizens are moving on, how they are so ready for it to be done, and they just want to continue on with their lives and act like this never happened. And they're acting as if it's over before it's even over. So, again, this could be an intentional thing on Wouk's part. Now let's transition to talking specifically about the miniseries as adaptations of the books, something I wasn't able to do when I reviewed the miniseries. With regard to the narrative, it took no time at all for me to realize that the miniseries, directed and produced by Dan Curtis, are very faithful adaptations of the books. The Winds of War in particular is almost a play-by-play, word-for-word adaptation. Almost. There are some changes here and there, but nothing of major significance, and Herman Wouk himself wrote the screenplay. Casting, though, is interesting now that I know how Wouk initially described his characters. Nothing about Pug Henry's appearance suggests that Robert Mitchum should play him. Not that Mitchum didn't work for the part, but wow, Pug is supposed to be very short, and Mitchum was not. Polly Bergen was spot on as Pug's wife Rhoda. She captured everything about the character, including her zooming conversation. Much as I had my doubts at the time, I have come to feel that Jan Michael Vincent was the better Byron Henry. The character and the actor both had to grow on me, and Jan Michael Vincent was more memorable than his replacement, Hart Bochner, who I just never got used to in the part. It's interesting, though, how many comments there are about Byron's looks changing after combat and loss. He becomes like a different person, and in the miniseries, he really is a different person. A similar thing happens with Hitler. I still prefer Gunter Meissner's Hitler, but although at the time I was disappointed that they changed actors, having read the book, it kind of makes sense. As Rune describes him, there are really two Hitlers, a Jekyll and Hyde takes over at Stalingrad. Gunter Meissner and Steven Berkoff play equally good Hitlers. They're just playing him at different stages. I still prefer John Gielgud over John Houseman for Aaron Jastrow, and I think I did an okay job picturing Gielgud in the role in The Winds of War. Though Gielgud has an Englishness about him that's hard to shake off, I still think he was a better fit for the character. And I still prefer Jane Seymour as Natalie over Ally McGraw. Natalie is supposed to be older than Byron, but only by a few years. She's 27. And McGraw, who was 44 at the time, although she looks great, she still looks great, she came across as much older, and it seemed like she was trying to seduce Byron in Siena, which she wasn't. Victoria Tennant was a fine choice for Pamela Tusbury, except the character is a brunette, not a blonde, so there's that. really not that important. And I give her credit for making some of the book's clumsier and more cliched dialogue sound more authentic. The biggest change, I think, is that the miniseries includes Armin von Roon as a character played by Jeremy Kemp, who strikes up an unusual friendship with Pug Henry. In the books, they meet just a couple times and it's nothing significant, and years later, Henry takes on the translation of Roon's work, written in prison for English publication. But they have no special understanding as they do in the miniseries. Because of this change, the War and Remembrance miniseries was able to include more segments behind the scenes with Hitler than the book does. This leads to some very notable differences. Really, Hitler is barely in the book version. The assassination attempt is given just 2 pages, and his decline in health and power and his suicide are things that are going on in the background. Contrast that with the miniseries, which fleshes these things out, dramatizes them, gives them much more attention, and I liked that. It helped give us a picture of the entire war unfolding, which is something that it turns out Wouk didn't really do with the 2 books. It is the entire war, but it's like he's putting a magnifying glass on certain things here and there while other events are going on. The book would have been 5,000 pages if he had treated everything with equal attention and detail. I should mention that Herman Wouk wrote the teleplay for War and Remembrance, but there were also contributions from Dan Curtis and Earl W. Wallace. So for anyone asking what did I like better, I think I liked the Winds of War book better than the miniseries, although it's very close. But I think I liked the War and Remembrance miniseries better than the book. The book gets bogged down with Pug's relationship drama and with detailed naval battles, which I didn't necessarily have trouble following, but they just were not of as much interest to me as they were to the writer. Simultaneously, it doesn't feel as thorough regarding the rest of the war or as intense as The Winds of War did. The Winds of War felt more focused, even though both books had many characters and conflicts to cover. Also, I found watching the miniseries depiction of certain events more emotional and harrowing than reading about them in the book, where Wouk often takes such pains to avoid any sentimentality that my emotional response is somewhat curtailed. Wouk closes by reaffirming his mission in telling this long, detailed story of the war. Remembrance. Remembrance of all those who were killed and murdered so that their lives and deaths will not have been in vain. I hope that it's apparent to readers of the book and viewers of the miniseries that the events of World War II continue to be relevant for us in the present. Wouk depicts an American people too busy in the pursuit of pleasure and wealth to be bothered with things that are occurring in far-off places, a largely apathetic and spoiled society that gets bored when headlines become too repetitive. It's an unflattering picture, and one that unfortunately has a familiar ring to it. Wouk lived through this time. He himself served in the Navy during World War II, so I'm inclined to accept that he's telling it like he saw it. One of the major running storylines is concerned with Jewish Americans who don't get out of foreign countries when they have the chance. As the enemy closes in, various embassies struggle to keep up with the flood of desperate refugees, and these characters, who never should have stayed so long, feel the trap tightening around them. If you have paid any attention to world events in the last month and a half, that should sound familiar. Woke shows atrocious acts committed against European Jews being dismissed as exaggerations because of outrageous propaganda that had come before. What do you know? We still have people today who deny that the Holocaust happened, or roll their eyes when people bring it up. Woke exposes the prevalence of what I call soft anti-Semitism worldwide. Not all anti-Semitism is the smug, sneering attitude and the vicious abuse of Nazi Germany. Leslie Sloat refers to it as the Achilles heel of Western liberalism. Even among Jews, there is anti-Semitism. There are some people in the book who try to sound like the good guy, saying, well, I have nothing against them myself, but... And then there are others who frown and get vague and express half-hearted compassion mixed with some doubt. And others talk about Jews like they're beings from another planet. Perhaps Woke is painting with a broad brush to prove a point, but these are attitudes that existed then and still exist today. No matter how many times people said after the Holocaust, never again, we'll never forget. History has a terrible way of repeating itself. As for the way the Third Reich handled the Jewish problem, that's not really such a foreign concept. Passing one harmless little law after another that takes away the rights and freedoms of a certain group of people in an attempt to either get rid of them or force them to conform, making it more difficult for them to work, to recreate, to buy food, to afford housing, essentially to live. Sounds familiar to me, and it's not acceptable under any circumstances. And, you know, the bad guys don't go around saying, oh yes, we're the villains, we're so evil. No, they sneak up on you. They worm their way in there. In politics, the bad guys are self-righteous and firm in their convictions. They're in the right always. They're the injured party. Their hand was forced by someone else's act of aggression. What they're doing is only the logical, common-sense response. They claim the moral high ground. They think of themselves as constructing, not destroying. And eventually, if/when things start to go awry, it's always someone else's fault. They are incapable of making mistakes. There are other hot-button topics that Woke touches on. He's critical of the hypocrisy and untrustworthiness of some career politicians and high-ranking military officials, and he expresses criticism of the utopian pipe dream of socialism that leads to oligarchy, corruption, and bloodshed. But I absolutely do not want to open that can of worms. I think I've already gone far enough. I don't allow or welcome political discussion on this channel. This review has turned out to be much longer than I intended, and yet amazingly, I still avoided spoilers. I did express some criticism of the books, but I still maintain that they are 100% worth reading. There's so much valuable stuff in there, and it outweighs the other material. I enjoyed them, and I'm glad I decided to stop waffling and take the plunge. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please let me know what you think in the comments below, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.